to learn, because we can like really question, really challenge each other, and really dive into things.
Well, it's kind of a gravel. And it's just
All right, let's go ahead and get started. If you'll please pray with me. Father, thank you so much for this morning as we're able to gather here together. I do pray you be with us as we try to understand the different views people have had on Revelation. Help us, we want to be informed about them and not always necessarily molded, but help us that we might have some humility in all of these studies. Help us to be charitable in some of these views, but also to understand when it is that your word isn't being interpreted as it should. So please give us wisdom in all of that. Be with us these next 40 minutes or so, and we thank you for this time of study and anyone else that might be on the way to our building. Praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so Revelation Class 4. Jerry, I changed the date. Try to make sure that one was correct, so enjoy. Or don't be bothered. I guess it's like you won't gain something from it, but you won't lose. All right. We're continuing our introductory subject on eschatological views, eschatology views, however you want to put that. Let's see, introduction. So we're continuing our introduction classes. These are the 4 topics that I generally said we're going to try to cover before we get into the text. And we're still currently on the 4 views on Revelation. I'll be honest, a lot of these slides might go by really fast, and a lot of them we might sit on for a little bit. So I also got almost close to twice as many slides as I normally have, so I'm not entirely sure how it's all going to go. But because of that, we'll probably have to save a little bit of the millennial discussion towards next week, probably on the tail end of class.
You had said that your first class you put on YouTube on the Logan Church of Christ. I could not find
Well,
YouTube site.
you couldn't find any of our videos?
Well, I couldn't find Logan Church of Christ #1 on YouTube.
Yeah, I had a hard time finding that one too. I'll send you the link, but if you logged into YouTube as the Logan channel, then you can just go to my videos. But I can send you a link as well.
I have a Logan channel, so
Huh?
I don't know the Logan channel, I guess.
Okay,
Pull it up on the church computer. It would
yeah, I'll send you the link. That's probably the simplest thing. So, all right, 4 views on Revelation. Defining the 4 views. Here are once again the 4 views. There's a preterist, where most of Revelation took place in the first few centuries, Jerusalem and Rome. Generally, that's the preterist approach. Historicist. Revelation tells the story of church history, notably regarding the Reformation and papal system. This is probably the most popular way of the historicist view. Futurist. Essentially, chapters 4 to 22 have not yet been fulfilled. So, 3 chapters, yeah, cool, that's relevant to your church, but the rest of it's still going to come. Future. Idealist. The idealist would be hesitant to want to pinpoint the symbolism with historical events in the book of Revelation. Revelation, they would say, has timeless truths about good and evil and how this world works. Last week we covered the historicist view and the idealist view. We talked about how the 4 views correlate decently with how we approach the book of Revelation and time. So remember this chart here. The historicist view would say, oh yeah, chapters 4 through 19. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there about the church fathers, the medieval period, the Reformation, and the modern church today. And we're kind of running out of history, so we must be near the end, as they would say. Mixed views on how they would view the millennium. A lot of them might say it's within the church age, or I guess maybe some would have been post. And then finally the second coming, the resurrection, all of that's happening in the last 3 chapters or so. Whereas the idealist view is like, yeah, all of this stuff, the bowls and all that, you can find those truths in different times in history. Like these things just happen all the time because this is the way that the world works. Last week okay, skip that one. I did find a few examples of how the historicists might view some passages of Revelation, and I just kind of want to share them. Just some of them I think are kind of interesting, but I'm gonna go through them. Sorry, sweet boy. I'm gonna go through them kind of quickly because I mostly don't want us to linger, since I definitely don't agree with the historicist approach, and essentially no major groups do today either. But it's interesting to see it. Like, these guys aren't entirely making things out of left field. The locusts released from the abyss in Revelation chapter 9, they would say were the Muslim Arab hordes that overran North Africa, the Near East, and Spain during the 6th to 8th century. The two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 12, they say the two witnesses are, or that are also called the two olive trees and the two candlesticks, they are the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's a common and historicist interpretation of that. And honestly, when I read that, I was like, I feel like I've heard that before growing up myself. So again, still some lingering effects there. They would say that the beast out of the sea from Revelation 13, 1 to 8, that the beast is the earthly power supported by the dragon, which is Satan, and that it is the papal powers during the same 42 months mentioned above. The idealist view would see the setting with the trumpets, bowls, lampstands, etc. as telling timeless truths that don't correlate to a single instance of history. So, all right, now let's go ahead and cover the preterist and the futurist view. But a little bit of quick history for us here. We talked about how the historicist view came from, or was very much championed by the reformers, and it was very critical of the Pope. Well, Catholicism would respond with these very growing accusations and growing interpretations that are accusing the papal system. And they would respond often with either preterism or futurism, saying, here's kind of an alternative of how you might interpret the book of Revelation. It's not what these reformers are trying to tell you that it is. It's generally agreed that the Catholic Jesuit Luis de Alcazar, he wrote the first systematic preterist exposition during the Counter-Reformation, if you will. So the ideas of preterism have been around for a while, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it really gained a lot of traction, and I guess maybe more official standing when it was kind of championed by people that are trying to, defend the papacy, trying to defend this criticism that's going against the Catholic Church. But like I said, we do have evidences that at least a commentator from the 7th century interpreted Revelation as the calamity coming on the Jews from the Romans. Like, they would read it and say, yeah, that's what happened to Jerusalem when Rome overtook it. Eusebius, I believe in the 4th century, would make similar comments about Matthew 24. If you remember Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse of, when will the temple be destroyed and when will be the end of these things, he would, when will be the end of these things, and you get all this language of the sun and the moon will be blotted and all these things. Well, in the 4th century, we have documentation of people saying, yeah, that took place when Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. Eusebius didn't directly apply it to Revelation. However, he didn't believe Revelation was canonical, so that's probably why he didn't take that interpretation. But if he did, he probably would have seen some connections there as well. So again, there's just a little bit of history there. It is possible that this way of interpretation was around much longer, speaking of the preterist view, than this, but we really, like I said, we don't really have any long-form commentaries on Revelation from the very early church fathers. We might have snippets and different things, but nothing so well written out. Preterism is a Christian eschatological view or belief that interprets some or all prophecies of Revelation as events which have already been fulfilled in history. The term preterism comes from the Latin praeter, which is a prefix denoting that something is in the past or beyond. Pre, easy enough to remember, right? How can it be that that Revelation has already been fulfilled? Like, how would people even go about defending that these things have already taken place? Well, of course, preterists have to have a very high view of symbolism throughout the book of Revelation. And preterists, they'll often focus on the fulfillment of these prophecies through the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and with the fall of Rome in the 4th century. Which if you're reading Revelation and you see there's this criticism against some of the Jews and this talk about how Babylon actually, they say, how Babylon's going to fall, then you can see why people might read Revelation and say, yeah, this is talking about Babylon, Rome, and Rome fell. Just as John said these things will take place, that this kingdom would not actually last. Here's a common chart. Hope it's big enough you can kind of see. But essentially, one popular take on preterism, and actually very popular, is that chapters 4 through 11 are talking about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Maybe chapters 12 through 19 talking about the fall of Rome, which occurred around the 4th century, depending on kind of shifted scenes, I guess. And finally, they would say that the millennium, maybe it's during the church patristic, maybe during the medieval times, maybe the modern church is kind of the millennium going on right now. And then they would say, obviously second coming, resurrection, last judgment, all that that part is still gonna come. There's actually I think I get about that. Yeah, I'm gonna get that in my next slide. As I've said about all of the views we've talked about, there are variances even within it. Most preterists are split into two groups: the partial preterists and the full preterists. And by the way, I've heard a lot of people, when talking about full preterists or hyper preterists, they'll very happily slap the label of heretics onto that belief. We'll talk about that why, but I'm just letting you guys be aware of that. Partial preterists would typically say that chapters 1 through 20 are about the past, while the dragon being destroyed and the new Jerusalem and new heaven and new earth, they're about the future. That part still hasn't happened and it's still going to come. Hey, there's not a new Jerusalem. Hey, the Satan, he's still around this world. They would say, look around you. This world is not perfect. There's still some things that need to be fulfilled, but also, Jerusalem has fallen. Rome has fallen. So that's how they would view that. Whereas the full preterists would say that the whole book has already taken place and the kingdom has already been established. The millennium, the new heavens and new earth. It's not that it's already. Obviously, they'd look around you as well and say, the kingdom, things are still messed up, but Christ has already established his kingdom, is already reigning, we're reigning with him, and this is kind of it. So you can see why a lot of people might throw the tag of heretical on full preterists. There aren't many of those. Most preterists are partial preterists to some degree, but there are a few people you could find their material that would espouse that full preterist view. Obviously, there's even more symbolism in mind here when talking about full preterism. Let's see. Okay, yeah, this is the same slide that I just showed you. Okay. I will say though, however, if you're just talking about viewing Revelation as having to do with the past, then that could be viewed as a form of preterism as well. I've been surprised, and what I mean by that is there are people that they wouldn't read Jerusalem into Revelation. They wouldn't read Rome as a very direct prophecy of Rome's going to fall within reading Revelation. But in general, they're reading it with an eye towards the past, towards being important to people there, and that there are still some prophecies that for the early churches that were going to be fulfilled. Maybe not necessarily pinpointing all of Jerusalem's going to fall, Rome's going to fall, but I'm bringing this view about because I do think it's very important to read Revelation with an eye towards the past and seeing the context in there, but you don't entirely have to be tied down to it's clearly talking about Jerusalem. It's clearly talking about Rome here. So just bringing that one out there as well. I have a lot more I could say here about preterism and maybe defending why some people view it that way. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. If you remember next week, we're going to talk about authorship and date. And preterists typically have they really have a dog in the race when it comes to when the book of Revelation was written. If you guys look in your Bibles, I think most of them they might make some passing comment about, oh, there's some debate of when Revelation was written, but most people believe it's in the 90s, late 80s, somewhere in that time. If Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, then it's kind of weird to have a prophecy about how Jerusalem's going to fall when it already happened. It could be talking about when it fell, but preterists, by and large, will defend a belief that Revelation was written in the 70s because, of course, the prophecy was, that was before the prophecy was actually fulfilled. So we'll talk about that and why, and some of the arguments and why people go on and back and forth. But I don't think we'll spend too much time because it's a little bit important, but probably not as big a deal as spending a full class on that. We'll also talk about the Olivet Discourse. I kind of already alluded to that, about preterists viewing Jesus' prophecies, that long, scary idea of the sun and the moon and all these things, and they would take a lot of symbolism in there, and most often talk about how, Jesus saying this generation will not pass till Jerusalem falls, till the temple, specifically the temple, till the temple is destroyed, and that would fit in line with what Revelation is saying, according to a preterist view. All right, finally, we're going to talk about the futurist view. I intentionally chose to talk about this view last. Most of the sources that I have consulted have seen this view as the most popular view in the United States. Those same sources I have learned the most from have also been very critical about a particular branch of the futurist view. So I think if I'm being entirely honest, the reason I want to spend so much time on the views of Revelation is almost 50-50 of I want us to know the scope and have some humility, but also we need to address specifically classical dispensationalism, which is one of the futurist views. So let's go ahead and get into it. If you guys remember last week, I mentioned this book on the 4 views of the book of Revelation. You might remember, this book has scholarly representation of the 4 views of Revelation, as at least the 4 that they've listed here. The 4 current views listed include the preterist and idealist view, not futurist. But the other 2 views that they list are forms of the futurist view. That would be classical dispensationalism and then more progressive dispensationalism. That if you hear me stumbling over dispensationalism, it's going to happen a lot, so you might as well get used to it. Both of these views hold a form of the rapture before the time of tribulation. So I think a lot of us mostly are familiar with this idea of rapture and this disappearing and kind of a secret rapture. A lot of people might put it that way. So they actually list both of them there because classical dispensationalism is what probably most of us are familiar with. And then progressive dispensationalism, it's less sensational, but it still kind of has its history and its roots in classical dispensationalism. There is actually a futurist view that could be called futurist historical premillennialism, and this one has a long history, and that's not necessarily addressed in the book, but I think it's also because it's also not very popular today. Let's talk about classical dispensationalism first, and then we'll talk about the futurist or historical premillennialism. I had a little fun with this, so let's look at this. Obviously, the futurist view believes that most of the book of Revelation has not yet taken place. They would say that chapters 6 to 22, or maybe 4 to 22, are all in the future. And here are some things that have previously interested classical dispensationalists. 666 plus 666 plus 666 equals 1998. So I'm sure there was people that were very worried about what might happen in 1998 because of this. However, if you add 6 plus 6 plus 6 to 666 and 66, then you get 2016. Could this be important regarding the presidential election of 2016? Some people would see that and be worried. They would keep an eye for that because they're like, yeah, this could very much matter and be very important here. Revelation 17 talks about the beast. Let me go ahead and read it. 17 verse 11. The beast, which was and is not. Oh, that's such a cool verse. I can't wait to get to that part of it. Sorry. The beast, which was and is not, is himself also an eighth and is one of the seven. And he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. So in 1977, kind of the forerunner of the European Union was about to admit its 10th member. Now, so some people would, when they would see that the 10th member would come, like, aha, there are the 10 kings that Revelation is talking about. By the way, there are now 27 countries in the European, or in what became the European Union, so that idea has kind of fallen out of favor. But that's something that a number of people were actually concerned. I'll actually give you a number to tell you how influential some of these things can be. Revelation 9:16 tells us the army had 200 million soldiers on horses. I heard them say how many there were. So back in the 1960s, there was a report that China was now able to field an army of 200 million people. So someone else would point and say, aha, we need to watch out for China. There will also be these connections about the, what do they call them? The kings of the East, or something to that effect. So they're thinking China, it's, Eastern Hemisphere, 200 million, like, okay, the ends are surely going to come, or we're about to enter these things. If you remember, I've mentioned this one before. This is a book, a commentary, great book, by the way, for the Revelation 4 Views Revised and Updated. It's a commentary where you can read through Revelation and see what the different views would say, at least the 4 that I've given you. The idealist, preterist, futurist, historical, yes. Actually, it was interesting hearing why he included the historical, because even though it's no longer widely viewed, the way he puts it is, he says that because an interpretation of Revelation has gone through so many waves throughout history, it might be a little bit too premature to call this one entirely dead, because you never know what's going to become more popular in the times. But Steve Gregg, that I mentioned previously, he tells the following story, which I thought was very interesting, and some of you might be able to relate with this. He talks about how he says, I remember what the radio ministries would say during the time of the Soviet Union. Things are all lined up in the world, and the geopolitical situation is all lined up as the Bible says. And then in the late 1980s, to everyone's surprise, the Soviet Union fell, the Iron Curtain went down. Everything changed after that. So he says, I wanted to tune into the radio to see what they said about that. Everything before that was lined up exactly as the Bible had said, so I tuned in. The fall of the Soviet Union has brought things into precise alignment in what the Bible says, what happened in the last days. So Steve's he was starting to become more disillusioned with this. Like, no matter what, it seems that these ministries, these people that will interpret the book of Revelation in this way, somehow it always kind of happens to fit into, or things change. And there have been so many incorrect, like everything I've listed to you. Actually, we'll talk about this in a little bit. A little bit more. Similarly, there was an author from before World War II. He claimed that the League of Nations were these 10 kings. However, at the time, there were 13 nations, member nations, not 10. And he himself admitted to this fact. But he addressed the people's objections to him saying this. And the way he did it is, he said, his reasoning was that you have to realize that there are 13 nations so that we will not recognize it for what it is. That it is the deceptiveness of the devil. So even a lot of people this is a guy he was a reputable teacher with a good-sized church, and this is kind of the approach he would take, and that he defended, and presumably to his church and to anywhere else that he had influence. Billy Graham himself, during the 50s, would believe that the end was very near, and I hope that at the very least, when we talk about all the views on Revelation, we can have a little humility in that so many people in history have thought their times have been the last days. Whether it was during, what's it called, the bubonic plague, whether it's during the Cold War, whether it's during all the persecution that the church faced in the early centuries right before, right before Constantine and, Christianity being accepted and eventually being the official religion in Rome. Like, so many people in history have had some claim to believing that surely the end must be near. All right, let's do one more example, and then I'll have some comments on this approach. Let's see, where am I at? Yeah. In 1988, there was a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1988. This blew my mind. It sold more than 3 million copies, mostly in the United States. I don't know if some of you, remember this from that time or were familiar with it. I've heard people, one of the people I was listening to, he said that he had a buddy that worked at a Christian bookstore, and the owner told him, hey, sell as many of these as you can, because when next year they're not going to sell very well. So you can criticize that approach however you want. But 3 million books in the United States, I don't know, what's the population of the US? I can't imagine a book on prophecy today's day and age. It was a less connected world back then, 1988. But 3 million copies of a book, that is staggering for mostly the United States. So some people must have been influenced, must have had some belief, must have been maybe curious, but to me that's staggering. This guy's giving my profession a bad name, by the way. I'm joking. Edgar Withenant, a former NASA engineer and Bible student, he later wrote updated editions for his 1989, for 1993, and for 1994. Thankfully, those books did not sell as well as the first one he wrote, but I would say a lot of the damage was done there. All right. Obviously, anything that I mentioned so far in these examples, no one holds to these interpretations anymore because time has passed, times have changed. It doesn't fit anymore. But similar predictions and or prophecies continue to be made today. This is simply a very small tour through the history of prediction and interpretation in this tradition. And there is actually an entire Wikipedia page that tracks past and future predictions and prophecies of when the end will be, including one by Isaac Newton, who predicted 2060. So keep an eye out for that one. Or please don't. Okay, I do want to state this. What? Oh, thank you. Are we back? Okay. Thank you. Oh, come on. Okay. I do want to state this. Just because these predictions are wrong, it does not mean that this approach is wrong. I believe that this approach is wrong. Oh, come on. Where'd you go? I do believe that this approach is wrong. What? Oh, yeah. That's weird. Plug it all in. Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, just because these predictions are wrong, it doesn't mean that the approach is wrong. I do believe that this approach is wrong, but failed prophecies are not a good enough reason to dismiss this approach, I would say. Obviously, a lot of people believe that because they continue on in this approach, but I think we need a. That's why I listed out in my first classes what are some of the things that are principles for how you're going to interpret the book of Revelation. I wish there were, somebody I could say that a lot of these ministries that made these predictions, they were wrong and they entirely lost their followers, but that's simply not true. a lot of people continued in that, and they continue to look for answers within that. So I wanted to make the statement because, yes, it's so easy to be critical. You can be critical of specific ministries, try and do that, but the approach as a whole, just pointing out that they're wrong hasn't been a good enough reason for people to stop trying in different ways or forms. So we need to, if we're talking about this with someone else, we need to give them a better way, or one would be more biblical faithful with how the text is demanding to be read, if that makes sense. Let's see. There really are, in some cases, there are really impressive connections that can be found in the Futurist view. But this is also true of the Preterist and the historical view. So you kind of have to be careful. There are reasons why these different views pop up, and why people that have tried, many people that are self-proclaimed Christians that have tried to be faithful and done wonderful things have believed these different views. So hopefully there is some humility to be had in there, and hopefully also some grace there as well. All right. I've mostly talked about examples of how classical dispensationalists have interpreted Revelation, but here are some broader and more important distinctions. They believe in a rapture before the tribulation and before Jesus' 1,000-year reign. I'm about to get into the rapture, but does anyone need any clarification? Again, it's not a typical class where I can have comments and go back and forth in normal ways, since we're not really looking at the text. But does anyone have anything they want to ask or give or need clarification on?
Where does the name classical dispensationalism come from?
Oh gosh. I actually talk about.
What does it technically mean?
It's dispensationalism. It's weird. Dispensationalism is essentially, very broadly speaking, the idea that God doesn't deal with Israel and church at the same times. So dispensations, very times. One form of it is that God will deal with, Jews are saved by the law. In the Old Testament, the church is saved by grace. But if you hear why a lot of people that hold this view are really worried about Israel, is because they believe that there will be an age where God deals with Israel again, and that will be a different dispensation later on. So dispensations just kind of ideas of eras or periods that things are split into. Now, because of that, it's very closely now associated with rapture theology and end times, but that's the idea of it. Okay. Like I said, they'll typically believe in a rapture before the tribulation and before Jesus' 1,000-year reign. Let's look at our chart again. You can see here the first century churches, sure, the medieval times, things are going, that all happens. And then the rapture is going to happen. Believers will be raised. Then the tribulation is going to begin. All these things are going to happen. Then finally, 1,000 years, but it will be the second coming where believers, I believe, will reign with Christ in that time. 1,000 years, and then the final judgment where everyone else comes. So there is a rapture before the tribulation. So Christians will not go through the tribulation in this view. I began believing this view without even thinking about it, just because it was so popular. But we'll talk about that right now, probably. They would say that the tribulation shown in our chart is believed by most to be either a 7 or a 3.5 year period. After the tribulation, there will be a 1,000-year reign with Christ. Under this approach, this is kind of a funny thing to think about. Under this approach, most of the book of Revelation does not apply to most believers. If you look at our chart again, like believers are here, right? They're a rapture. There's going to be chapters 4 through 19. Believers aren't going to be in that, so you don't have to worry about it. Maybe some people will believe in Christ under this view during the tribulation, and maybe they'll go to the Bibles that don't have Christians in them anymore and try to look to Revelation to see what else is coming up. But it is kind of a funny thing to think about, that 4 through 19 doesn't actually involve believers under this view. You guys remember your homework from last week? I said, read Matthew 24. At that time, there will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken and one will be left. I asked you guys, who is being taken away and where are they being taken to? Did anyone have any answers off the top of their head, or that looked it up? Yeah, Jerry, what you got?
I believe,
You believe?
because I want to have grace for anybody who doesn't believe that.
Sure.
I need it. Is that the one taken are those that are going to heaven and those left are those who are left for judgment.
Okay.
Um,
The ones taken would be the ones going to heaven?
Yes. Now, I understand that the people who believe in the rapture believe that the people.
You forgot?
I mixed the two. But I'm not sure what people, I'm sure you know.
Sure.
Because that's why you have brought this particular one up. We're talking about the rapture.
Sure.
And I don't believe in the rapture.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah.
I believe Christ is coming back.
Yeah, sir.
No, I mean, it seems like, given that it's comparing it to the flood,
Mm-hmm.
and it mentions how the flood came and took them all away.
Yeah.
In that case, the people being taken away are the ones getting destroyed.
Yeah.
I mean, because like the rapture interpretation of this is that, right, like.
The believers will
the
be
good
taken.
people
Mhm.
are gonna get taken away and zooped up to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, the context of Noah feels like, well, no, the bad people are getting taken away and wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
And also in the context of, like, Israel's history, and because, like, doesn't the same pattern show up in some of the prophets? Like, sorry,
I can't speak to that.
But there's sort of this, like, every time Israel has dealt with people being taken away,
Mm.
it's to exile,
Oh, yeah.
right? Like,
Oh, yeah, I like that.
It's to destruction. It's to
So,
all these other types. It's the bad people getting taken away. I
Right.
guess.
the reason I bring this verse up, is because it's often brought up as an example of the rapture is talked about in the scriptures. Like, they will be taken away. But I'm with Sarah on this one. If you read it, it says, about that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be like the days of Noah. For as in these days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. At that time there will be 2 men in the field, and one will be taken away, and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken, and one will be left. If you're trying to use this as an example, it doesn't fit perfectly, because it seems like you don't want to be taken away, because like the people in Noah's day, the flood, took away, those that didn't believe Noah. And Jesus is paralleling that to what it's going to be. There's going to be, now, if you're reading it in the way I'm telling you, then you may not believe in a disappearing like that, but more this metaphorical of like, hey, you're going to be wiped away just like the day in people's Noah's, because you're not believing in God. So I would say this is not a good passage for a rapture, if there are any, which I would say no.
In verse 31, though, that same chapter, it says, and he, Christ, will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, and from one end of the sky to the other. So the gathering, being, the separation, if you will, which is like the separation of the wheat and the tares, or the separation of the sheep and the goats, is the way I see this.
Well, isn't the wheat and the tares, isn't the one being taken out, is the bad stuff, like taken away as well?
Well, they're taken at the same time. I mean, at the harvest, they're all, he says, don't take them out early.
I think we're mixing metaphors at that point, but I see your point about verse 31, though.
I don't think it's metaphor. He's talking in the tares and the wheat. He's saying, don't take out the tares early, let them stay with the wheat until it's time for the harvest.
Right.
So at the time of the harvest, the tares and the wheat all comes out at the same time. They're separated, just like the sheep and the goat.
Yeah, but in the immediate context here, I think it would make sense to say that it is the taking. When he's using the language of taken away, it's being taken away. Taking away the non-believers. It might be using parables in different forms, in different ways, in a different setting there. But I think the immediate one here, even if you're right and there's some confusion there, it's still not a very good example of when the rapture, that's what it would mean, I would say. Dylan.
I think that it's more about perspective rather than who's taken away in general. Because I'm with Jerry on that. There's a separation.
Mhm.
But if some powerful being were to happen and separate even just this room, half this room is going to think the other half was taken away, and then that other half is thinking, well, the other half was taken because we're separated. We're no longer a group or a unit. So depending on, you know, and in the moment that I'm talking about right here,
Right.
you don't know until, you know, a while later, like, oh, I was taken away from them, as opposed to them being taken away from me.
But I guess I think for the purposes of this class, if there is ambiguity on which one it is, it still doesn't make a very good passage for defending rapture here, I would say. So let's get
All
on.
on the same page there.
Maybe we'll talk about this passage later next week. Let me get through some slides here. Some classical dispensationalists might interpret this passage as talking about the rapture, assuming that it's talking about the end times, drawing on those parallels. We've kind of talked about that. Yeah, that's it. Let's see. By the way, I want to make this clear. Most views on Revelation still believe in some rapture. You might not like the word, but the popular view on the rapture is uniquely held by the futurists. Most self-proclaimed Christians believe in a rapture of sorts in the following sense of, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout and with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who remain, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. They would say, the other views wouldn't say that there's a rapture before tribulation. They would say if there's a rapture, if you want to call it that, we're going to be in the air at the same time that Christ comes. There's no secret rapture, no separation there. Classical dispensation, yeah.
But because there is this misuse of the term.
You want to abandon the terms, like you can have it?
Because there's that misuse, if people will presume that what you're talking about is this rapture before.
Yes, I would.
Therefore, to use the term is probably not wise if you don't believe it.
Sure, I would say be careful how you use that language, because some people, especially in some of the things you read, you might say there is a rapture, but not in the way you think. If you don't want to use that word, that's fine. That's probably more clear. I'm saying sometimes you read that, figure out which one they're talking about, because they might be thinking about the one you're thinking of, even if you don't like the word there. Others would argue that the rapture takes place at the same time as Christ's return, and that the tribulation and/or 1,000-year reign is now. It's happening now. And yes, the 1,000 years would be symbolic. There are more views, but it gets messy, so I'm not going to get into that. I'll skip our chart for now again. The idea of dispensations has other implications, but I fear getting too lost in class already. Sarah actually brought it up already, so we've kind of covered that a little bit. But yes, it has more to do with than just end times exactly. I will say that this theology of dispensationalism and classical dispensationalism as a whole was seemingly first articulated by John Darby in the 1830s. So it's a very new view, even if it's very popular. It does not have a long history of interpretation. Yet it's the most popular view in the American church today. Many prominent teachers and pastors and lay people hold to this view. Even atheists hold to this view, at least when they're pointing out that Jesus has not yet returned and fulfilled prophecy. So I heard a joke somewhere of like, oh yeah, an atheist might say, it's like, oh, Jesus didn't do this. It's like, well, it's because you atheists are a futurist, or at least you're assuming a futurist perspective, if you know what I mean. Preterism has often been a favorite view among scholars. Idealism has been used in conjunction with the other views like we talked about, and has also been modified by contemporary proponents to account for first century historicity of preterism. Let's remember, though, that God's word is not interpreted by popular vote. I've tried to understand these differing views and complex views, especially from the people who champion them. I've tried, guys. And I have my opinions that I will share in this class, but you also have to make these decisions for yourself in how you interpret it. Hopefully we can have these discussions and that push us all to grow in this area. Real quick, let me mention progressive dispensationalism. I'll quote from my Four Views book there, which says, "Progressive dispensationalism, the newest kid on the eschatological block, is beginning to capture the imagination of those who have grown weary over a sensationalist treatment of prophecy." So again, think of it as a less sensationalist view of classical dispensationalism. Yeah. And we've already read that this view has sprouted out of classical dispensationalism, but is likely to have less likely to have sensationalist prophecies. Now, real quick, I know we're a couple minutes past time, but I want to talk about Futurist View with a historical premillennialism. You see this chart here? It looks the same as classical dispensationalism in a lot of ways, except there's no rapture. Historically, this view has been held for a very long time by various different people. It does have a deep history, and it doesn't have this rapture view. You could still see as they're believing this tribulation is going to come and still talking about 4 through 19, but it would say that the church is going to go through that tribulation and that, but the Lord will keep us from those things. So there is a view of futurists that is not, that I wouldn't be as critical as I have been about classical dispensationalism, and there is a long history of that. So I wanted to point it out. But honestly, under this view, there's no rapture, but there's still belief of the resurrection of believers and Christ reigning 1,000 years. Honestly, I'm not sure why this view is not more popular. Perhaps there's an innate desire for end times to be more fantastical, and so classical dispensationalism seems to be more attractive on the surface. Perhaps there aren't room for two futurist views to be popular. I really don't know. All right, that's it. I do need to say once more that these are 4 general views of Revelation. Many might feel that their view is not represented or that I didn't present it correctly. That might be true because there is wiggle room within the 4 views. However, I've tried my best. So tried to listen to reasonable people that champion these different views. I've tried to present them mostly fairly, though I'm sure you've noticed my criticism is especially harsh on some branches of these views. All right, that's it. Many commentators will often mention an eclectic view approach, which simply means that they take insights from more than one approach. It's especially true when talking about different parts of Revelation, and I'd say there is some wisdom in that. All right, that's it for now. We'll talk about a little about millennial next week, but also authorship and date. Any last questions or comments? Yes?
Progressive futurist, I didn't quite get what that was.
I didn't.
You changed terminologies.
Yes, I did not cover progressive dispensationalism in detail. All I said is that it's a less sensationalist version of classical dispensationalism.
That's as much as you said about that.
Yes.
Moved on to the-
Yes. Yeah, to historical premillennial futurists. So, because they're very similar, the dispensationalist views. There could be details, but obviously I was running out of time. So, all right. Anything else?
Cuando Pablo le escribe a los tesalonicenses, él está escribiendo el versículo, principalmente el capítulo 4, versículo 17, que dice: luego nosotros los que vivimos, los que hayamos quedado, seremos arrebatados juntamente con ellos en las nubes para recibir al Señor en el aire, y así estaremos con el Señor. Está escribiendo en el presente. Para él estaba cerca del segundo enemigo. Y para él, según escribe, según ese tiempo que está escribiendo, posiblemente para él estaba esperando que él estuviera vivo cuando viniera. Entonces, ahí siento que en un momento no encaja el milenio pues, con las palabras de Pablo.
¿Qué?
El milenio que pretenden los movimientos religiosos que después de que venga Jesús a ver 1000 años, ¿verdad? Él está pensando en el milenio que están con eso. Y lo otro que me da la idea es que Apocalipsis se escribe antes del Evangelio de Juan y de Primera de Juan. Entonces todo esto acopla a que el milenio es el que estamos viviendo.
Yeah, we'll get into that more next week. But talking about Paul's perspective on 1 Thessalonians 4:16, he's talking in the present. He seems to believe that Christ will be near, or that he might come soon. And it's, I guess, simplifying Gabriel's saying, it's like it makes more sense to believe that we're in the millennium now. Again, no entré a eso esta semana, pero tal vez la próxima hablamos de eso. Maybe next week we talk about the millennium. Clearly it's a big topic, so. All right. Thanks, everyone. We are dismissed for worship.